So welcome to Procurement Management. I'm Joanne Greenblos, and these upcoming slides and a corresponding video are for those students in our courses who have paid for the course and are just looking to either refresh their minds on what we covered or missed a topic and would like to hear it for the first time to catch up. So with that in mind, procurement management is going to be the topic that we are going to cover. So here are the topics that we're going to cover for procurement management. There's 3 processes, and so you'll need to know the process names and which process group they're in. We will talk about the 5 components of a contract, of which all need to be present in order for the contract to be valid. We will talk about making the decision and how to do so as far as whether you should contract at all, and that would be make versus buy or make versus rent. We will cover the different contract types, which would include fixed price contracts and cost reimbursable contracts, which one benefits the buyer versus the seller, so where the risk is. Some components of certain contracts can involve share, especially if you have an incentive fee contract. And so how does share work? And share also enters into contracts that are using point of total assumption, which is a fixed price incentive fee contract. We'll talk about the different types of bid documents and when you would use each. And then 2 main types of scope of work and what type of contract would be appropriate depending on the scope of work type that you used. Different methods for source selection. How are you going to be picking your suppliers? Is it going to be least cost, so who has the lowest bid? Is it going to be qualifications based? Who's got the highest qualifications, in other words, or is it going to perhaps be a combination of qualifications and cost? Or is it going to be sole source, which is a non-competitive method of selection? You're only picking one supplier in that case. We'll talk a little bit about different procurement strategies, design build, design bid build, design build operate or transfer, and these deal primarily with construction type contracts. Then we'll talk about standard terms of conditions as a component of a contract, as well as special provisions. And then finally we'll talk about someone files a claim on a contract and believing the other side is in default. What is your recourse? Do you have to go to litigation, or is there some type of alternative dispute resolution method that you can use, like an arbiter, for example? So these are the procurement topics. Here's the process group knowledge area matrix, and you'll see procurement management is second from the bottom there. 3 processes, 1 in planning, 1 in executing, and 1 in monitoring and controlling. When we're talking about procurement, we're talking about working with an outside company. Therefore, you've got a contract in place, and any kind of a mistake can ultimately have a legal consequence. So it's important to understand exactly how contracts are written and what recourses you may have through the course of the contract's life. From the exam, you should know what the different contract types are, and we'll go through 9 different types, what the various procurement documents are that would be associated with each contract type, and what the differences would be between them. You'll also need to know the names of the processes, there's 3, and how they interconnect. And unless stated otherwise, assume that the procurement is going to be from the buyer's perspective. So you would be the buyer, and then you'd be purchasing some type of service from a contractor. Let's talk first about some trends in the procurement. And in particular, there's been some advances in tools. For example, building information model software, BIM software, allows you to build a model beyond 3 dimensions so that you can add other elements such as cost and time. Autodesk, for example, supports such features. The other advance, which is actually a very good thing, is that risk is now being written into contracts, especially those fixed price type contracts, with buyers agreeing to take over some of the responsibility, especially for those areas that the sellers will not have control over. In addition, with very large mega projects, we're finding that buyers and sellers are working more collaboratively together, and there's a lot of benefits that they can employ in so doing, including taking advantage of procurement and quantity discounts, and also a greater emphasis on supply chain management. A couple more trends. We're finding that Big Brother may be watching, meaning that in some construction sites, webcams are being installed so as to view progress. And other trends that we're seeing are that sometimes buyers are hiring suppliers just for a trial run, and either to then continue the rest of the contract or maybe not having intended to and get someone else for the rest of the contract. And also a trend where part of a project might be waterfall and another part in agile, so a combination or a hybrid. Here's the 3 processes. The first is plan procurement management, and what happens here is you make a decision as to whether or not you're going to outsource part of the project, any or even all of the project. So that's where a make versus buy analysis is done. And if you decide that you do want to outsource, then you would have to select what would be an appropriate contract type for it, and who you would look to as vendors. So there's a whole number of decisions and analysis that would have to take place. And then the next step would be conduct procurements, where you now have an idea of what type of contract you want. So you're going to be sending out a request for a proposal or a request for a quote to various suppliers, and be getting those back, and then ultimately making a selection as to which supplier you're going to be using. This particular process then ends once you've made that selection and awarded the contract. Note that this part takes place during the executing process group, and that's because this is work that you are doing as the project manager. You are doing all this determination and analysis as to which supplier you're going to be using. The contract itself isn't being executed yet. It's just your activities that are in the executing part of it. And then for the third process, control procurements, we now know who the contractor is going to be, and the contract has been awarded. So with this part, we are now going to have the contractor go ahead and start executing the work of the contract, and our role as a project manager will be to monitor them, and just as we would any other members of the project team, make corrections as necessary, and then ultimately accept the work of the contract and close the contract out. So here again shows the 3 processes. The result of plan procurement management will be a procurement management plan, which by now you should know is a subsidiary plan and is going to become part of the overall project management plan. Procurement documentation will be all the associated documents required that will be used for this particular contract. Then conduct procurements. You're looking for a vendor. You award it with a contract, and PMI calls that an agreement. So you see agreement as an output, and as well as the selected sellers. And notice that that is plural, because you could either have decided to pick multiple suppliers, or you could pick, have narrowed down a list of suppliers to a short list, and then have an evaluation committee ultimately be the one to decide who the final supplier is going to be. Then the contract work begins, as I mentioned, and you're in the monitoring and controlling process group here. Control procurements is a control process like many of the other control processes in the PMBOK guide, where you're comparing plan against actual work results of the contractor. Ultimately, you're going to be closing the contract, archiving that contract in the contract file, and any other closing activities, accepting the work of the contractor, of course. So that's a high-level view of what occurs. Now, as I mentioned, plan procurement management, the first process. At this point, PMI would expect that you would be working as the project manager in conjunction with a legal person that has been appointed at your project by your company, and that could be somebody in purchasing, but generally you wouldn't be the one who would be in charge of the contract itself or writing up the contract itself, but you would instead be working in conjunction with this person, and then they'd probably be assisting you in determining what type of contract to use and what type of bid documents would be needed. And an example of such bid documents would be what you see here: request for information, request for quote, request for proposal, and then what criteria you're going to use to select one of the proposals. So here's the etude diagram for plan procurement management. We have 6 inputs, 5 tools and techniques, and 10 outputs. Of course, by now you should know that whenever you're creating a subsidiary plan, which is what you're doing in this process, that you've got some inputs that come standard, and those would be the project charter, business documents, and the project management plan. And so the procurement management plan itself is going to be the subsidiary plan. Unique to this process, however, it doesn't create just a subsidiary plan. It also makes some decisions, such as whether or not you should even enter into a contract at all. So you're doing a make versus buy analysis here. So looking at some of the inputs, we talked about the standard ones when you're creating a subsidiary plan. But if you look at some of the project documents that might be involved, these are all helpful, like the milestone list, the team assignments, and certainly the requirements and the risk, as you think about what needs to be done and whether or not it makes sense to have a contract and outsource part of the work. So there's a variety of reasons why you would outsource, and we'll talk about some of those. We've got some IFs and OPAs here. And we can say that the IFs in particular would include the set of sellers that are in the marketplace that are available to perhaps bid on your project. And so that would be considered an external IF in this case. And correspondingly, any available products and services that are out there in the market. And there may also be specific contract types or standard terms and conditions which might apply in your case and have an impact on how you can create a contract. And that would also include regulatory and legal requirements as well. And so that again would fall in under IF. So for tools and techniques, we have We have 5 of them. Besides expert judgment, we've got market research so that you can find out which vendors are available out there. Under data analysis, we have make or buy analysis. So you're making that determination on whether it makes sense to keep it in-house or outsource. And then for outputs, we have 10 of them. The procurement management plan we mentioned. We'll talk about your procurement strategy and which ways you're going to be setting up the contract based on that strategy. We'll talk about bid documents that would be required depending on the type of contract, and statement of work, what procurement statement of work, what criteria you're going to use to select your vendors, whether or not you're going to use an independent cost estimate, and certainly the make or buy decision is a major output here for planned procurement management. One thing I want to mention is that your items 3 through 6 there are collectively by PMI called procurement documentation. So you'll see them showing up again in the ITUs, and this is what they mean by procurement documentation. It's these 3, 4, 5, and 6 items. So the other thing that is unique about this planning process is that it has the ability to issue a change request if needed. And that could be because doing something by outsourcing may require a change in the requirements or some other areas that you've already got under configuration management. And so there you've got the ability to issue a change request. Also, we have project document updates and OPA updates, and in particular with OPA, let's say you've done some research on your potential sellers that are out there. Why not document and save that research so that you can use it again for future projects? And so then you'd update information on those sellers, and that comes in as an OPA update. So, what is a contract? It's a mutually binding agreement. It's a legal agreement between a buyer and a seller. There's various names for contracts. They can be a subcontract, they can be an agreement, which is what PMI calls it, and even a purchase order, which we don't always think of as being a contract, but PMI does consider a purchase order as its own separate type of contract. And there's 5 components, all of which you need to have in place for it to be a legal contract. If one of these is missing, then you don't have a legal contract. So they all have to have capacity, meaning that you are of legal age to enter into a contract, number 1, and that you've been authorized by the organization to enter into a contract. So just because you're an employee of the organization doesn't mean you're authorized. You have to have that authorization. There has to be an offer to exchange something, and there has to be an acceptance from a buyer willing to accept that offer. And then consideration means that once you've got an offer and acceptance, something has to change possession. So it seems like an odd thing, but sometimes you'll hear of people that want to give away maybe a house that has no value to them, and they really can't do it. They can't give it away for free because that would not have the consideration aspect to it. So they sell it for $1, which means now you've got an exchange. So that they receive the house for $1. The other fifth component then is the legal purpose. The contract has to be done for a legal purpose. It can't be done for something that would violate the law. And a memory tool for that is Cold Cola, capacity, consideration, offer, legal, and acceptance. So within OPA, you have a pre-qualified sellers list. And with pre-qualified sellers list will depend on your organization, if you even have one. Not every organization does, but basically it saves you time because you don't have to go through the vetting process to find out who's got the availability and who's got the capability to provide what you need. Also within OPA, you might have particular policies and procedures about how to open up a contract with a contractor or a supplier, and there might be contract templates. And then also within OPA, which is really buried in there, so you have to know that it's even there, are the various types of contracts that you're allowed to enter into by your organization. Some organizations are very particular about the type of contract that you're allowed to use. So that's why it's just not necessarily open to all types of contracts, and it comes in as an OPA in that case. And we'll talk about the different contract types. So a little bit more on that pre-approved seller list or that qualified sellers list. It is a screening mechanism that's supposedly supposed to save you time. The problem might be, of course, that maybe your list may not be as comprehensive as it could, or might not have been scrubbed in a while, and so you always have a potential there that it could be problematic. But ideally, it will save you time because these vendors have already been researched and vetted. Within a contract, there's many components, and they get longer and longer all the time, as you're probably aware. Some of the aspects of a contract would include the statement of work, which is a very important part of it, the period of performance, or when is it going to take place, what is the pricing and the fees within the contract, how will the work of the contract be inspected, how will it be accepted, is there any limitation of liability, do you need to have insurance or performance bonds for very high capital type projects, and if there's a claim that is going to be filed, is there an alternative dispute resolution method, and if so, who would that be and what is their contact info? What is the list of the deliverables that are going to be provided? What are the main roles and responsibilities of the applicable stakeholders? And are you allowed to subcontract? Once the contract is complete, is there going to be a service level agreement? Where is the contract work going to take place? Where is the result of it going to be delivered? How is it going to be supported afterwards? And are there any penalties for not getting done by a certain time? Or are there any incentives for getting done early or maybe under budget? And what is the change control procedure that's going to be used on the project? So you can see there's a lot of different aspects to a contract. And just as there is multiple names for a contract itself, you can have multiple names for a buyer and a seller. So buyer would be considered a prime. Seller might be the subcontractor. And then acquiring organization or the government agency or the service requester or the purchaser would all be considered the buyer, and then the seller, the vendor, the supplier, the contractor. So let's go through the different contract types. Um, Purchase order, which we mentioned before, is its own type of contract. Fixed price contracts, and we'll go through a few of those variations. Time and materials, which is its own type of contract as well, and cost reimbursable. And there's a few variations or flavors of those as well. So it's important to understand specifically, though, where the risk is on each type of contract. Does a fixed price contract benefit a buyer more than a seller, or vice versa? Does a purchase order benefit a buyer versus a seller, or vice versa? So it's very important to know that, and you will most likely be asked a question related to that on the exam. And here's the different types of contracts that you could have, and there's always even more on top of this, but these are the main ones that you should know for the exam. This particular slide is in the Google site, by the way, in the procurement folder. So for the cost reimbursable contracts, you've got cost plus fixed fee, you've got cost plus percentage of cost plus incentive fee, and cost plus award fee. Then for fixed price, you've got firm fixed price with an incentive fee, and fixed price with an economic adjustment. Then, of course, on top of that, you've got time and materials and purchase orders. So here's where the risk comes into play. There's always been a little bit of a debate as to where exactly on this scale of risk each contract goes. And you'll notice that within the Crosswind book, they didn't really, they kind of gave up on trying to place it contract type by contract type, which might actually be a smart idea. It's probably more important that you know the outside boundaries than you do what's in between, as well as the neutral. So starting right with the neutral, let's start there. If we were to pick a T&M contract, which is a time and materials contract, or a purchase order, it would be considered risk neutral for both parties. So it doesn't benefit the buyer or the seller any one way or another. On the other hand, if you looked at CPPC, which is cost plus percentage of cost, that is a huge amount of risk for the buyer and very, very little, if any, for the seller. Conversely, if you looked at FFP, or firm fixed price, that is very little risk for the buyer and a lot for the seller. So those are the ones, those three, CPPC, TNM, and FFP, as well as PO, that I would really focus on in terms of risk, knowing which is the worst, which is the best from a buyer versus seller perspective, and not worry so much about whether FPIF or FPEPA is slightly more risky than each other. They're going to be a little less risky for the seller. In other words, FFP would be a little bit more, but whether they are more or less risky than each other is probably not that important. And similarly with CPAF, PIF, and CPFF. So hopefully that makes sense. And once we go into the different contract types, it will be clear why these contract types are where the risk is, where it is. Okay, so incentive fees are built into some contracts. You can have an incentive fee built into a cost reimbursable or built into a fixed price contract. And generally you're doing it because you want to get some level of productivity improved. Maybe you want to get something done early, or maybe you want to get something done under budget. And we'll talk more about that after we go through the 9 contract types. So here's the 9 types that we'll cover, starting with the purchase order, or PO. As you recall, this is neutral for both the buyer and the seller. A PO is it's considered a unilateral agreement because approval is only needed by one party, since the other party has already offered this product at a predefined price. So basically it's like saying, here's the computer monitor, $179, take it or leave it. There's not like a negotiation or anything like that that takes place. And because of that, you would typically use a PO for commodity type items, off-the-shelf type items that don't require any customization. Also note here that sometimes a workplace might get a different contract signed off, like a fixed price or a cost reimbursable, and then get a PO. But PMI, however, considers a PO to be a separate contract. So that might be done a little bit differently than PMI would views it in the real world. Okay, so the next is firm fixed price, and if you remember from that graph previously, the significant amount of risk for the seller and really hardly any for the buyer. And that's because the buyer knows how much it's going to cost up front and how much they have to outlay. There's no surprises at the end. The problem with the seller is that if you haven't estimated correctly on this type of a contract, you could end up having too low of an estimate to the extent that it doesn't cover all your costs, and therefore you're not even getting any profit. So you could lose money on such a contract. An example is the purchase of a computer network from a vendor for $2 million after providing the seller a detailed scope of work. And that detailed scope of work is an important phrase because PMI would say that if you are able to provide a lot of details and a lot of information about exactly what it is you're looking for, then it's much easier for contractors to be able to put a realistic bid on the project and then not lose their shirt afterwards because they didn't quite understand the entire scope of work. So PMI would say then, in such a case, it's okay to use firm fixed price. But be careful, because if you are not sure exactly of what the details are and you can't describe it that well, PMI would say that firm fixed price would not be the way for you to go. Now you can have fixed price with an incentive fee. So basically you want to get some level of productivity and encourage some level of productivity above what you would normally have. So for example, you might be a city that is buying services from a construction company to put in a new freeway for $4 million, but for every week that you finish before a certain date, you can receive an incentive of $65,000. So this is a little bit better from the seller's perspective because they have the option of receiving additional funds if they meet that incentive. Okay, so fixed price economic price adjustment is for a long-term project, a long-term contract, typically multiple years. And in such a situation, it's fixed price, but you agree to increase the contract value by a certain amount each year so as to keep up with the cost of living or some other type of negotiated standard. So if we were to talk about that freeway, putting that freeway in for $4 million, but then at the beginning of each year, you're going to increase the contract relative to a national cost of living rate or some other negotiated standard. For example, material costs could be rising by a certain amount each year, and so you might want to cover yourself for that. So now we're going to be discussing the cost reimbursable contracts, and this is where the risk shifts from the seller to the buyer, because the buyer doesn't know necessarily up front what the full value of the contract is going to be towards, until they get closer to the end of the contract, although you can always put a ceiling price in. It does make it riskier. With a cost plus fixed fee, then the seller has all of their costs reimbursed, plus the fee part, which is their profit. The fact that it's a fixed fee is helpful to the buyer because they know exactly how much money to budget up front, which is why the risk for them really is more on the medium side as opposed to the high side. The other thing about a cost reimbursable contract is typically, as a buyer, you will need copies of receipts and will need to verify that what you're being invoiced matches the receipts. So the other thing to know about a cost reimbursable contract is, if you see in the description here, it says used when the buyer lacks detail to know specifically what is needed to build it. So that would mean that you don't have a very detailed scope of work built into the contract, because you may know at a very high level what you need, but you don't really know the details, and those details aren't important to you as long as the functionality is met. So in that situation with that type of a scope of work, PMI would say that a cost reimbursable or a cost plus contract would be very appropriate. If you did have a lot of information, again, as we just discussed in the fixed type contracts, then the fixed, it would be the way to go in that case. So here's an example of a cost plus fixed fee. A buyer hires a vendor to produce a video training series, but not sure of all the detail needed, and agrees to pay the vendor for whatever their costs are, plus the $37,000 fee, which is their profit. So again, the key words there being they're not sure of the detail needed, therefore cost reimbursable would be appropriate in this case. Cost plus incentive fee is similar to fixed price incentive fee, except that it's cost reimbursable. So again, similar in the same sense that you want to improve upon some productivity by using an incentive fee, except that you're also paying for costs here in this case. So example is hiring a company to write a manual for publication and sale. The buyer will agree to pay the costs involved plus an incentive fee of $7,500 for every week that you're done before an estimated completion date. So trying to incentivize you to get in quicker to market. And then there's cost plus award fee, and people generally get cost plus incentive fee and cost plus award fee confused, so be very careful about this one. Award fee deals with very subjective criteria, whereas an incentive fee is very quantitative, very, very objective criteria, such as you have to complete by a certain date, and then you either did it or you didn't. But with an award fee, whether you've met that criteria is purely up to the buyer's discretion. So an example would be a buyer agreeing to pay for the costs of a freeway bridge, but due to the number of people impacted, if the seller meets the agreed on date and completes the bridge with minimal negative impact to the environment, then the buyer will award the seller an additional $500,000. So now the question is, how do you define minimal negative impact to the environment? And the seller might think that they've done it, and the buyer might disagree. So with an award fee, you can't guarantee that you will get the award. It's a little riskier from your perspective because you don't know if you're going to get that award or not because of the fact that it's not an objective criteria. And then there's cost plus percentage of cost, which is also called cost plus fee. And this has significant amount of risk for the buyer. If you remember that graph again, this was at the far end, this was at the far left, representing the most risk for the buyer, and the least amount of risk for the seller. And the reason for that is because the seller is getting all of their costs paid for, plus they're getting a percentage of the costs as their profit or their fee. So the higher the costs, the higher the profit. Therefore, there's very little incentive to try to keep costs low, which could become a problem. And you might have ethical issues and so on. However, there's cases where this is the only type of contract you're going to get. For example, if you wanted to hire an interior designer, then that's the type of contract that you'd have to use. They will furnish your home, and then their fee will be, for example, 20% of whatever the furnishings are. If you want to hire a real estate agent, they will also work with that type of a contract. Their commission will be higher for a higher priced home than for a lower priced home. But generally, if you're a company, you're just looking to outsource part of a project, you probably wouldn't go for that if you could avoid it. And then time and materials is sort of a blend between fixed price and cost reimbursable. You're paying an hourly rate in this case, and that rate is the fixed part of it. The part that's not fixed is necessarily how many hours that it's going to require. And so you could put in a ceiling at that, in that case from a buyer's perspective, and not to exceed a certain dollar amount. But it's generally considered to be risk neutral for both. So example is buying a tech writer, or buying or supplementing your staff with a tech writer at $75 an hour, or having a bathroom added to your house at $50 an hour plus whatever the cost of materials are. So now question, what type of contract is typically used for staff supplementation? And that should have been an easy one, time and materials. What type has the most risk for the seller? Hopefully this is also an easy one. Yep. Most risk for the seller would be fixed price. Least risk for the buyer. And here's a little exercise. If you know exactly what needs to be done, what type of contract would be best of the different main contract types? So it should be fixed price because you can specify the scope of work precisely. Therefore, fixed price would be okay. People can estimate and give realistic estimates. What if you're going to buy a standard off-the-shelf item? What would you use? Hopefully you thought of purchase order. What if you need to have work accomplished but don't have a lot of time to audit invoices to ensure that the costs are what you're being billed. Then if you don't want to be auditing invoices to match up costs with your receipts with your invoice, then fixed price is probably the way to go. What if you need to begin work right away? What would be the fastest type of contract to get into? So hopefully you thought of time and materials. Generally, it is a pretty quick type of contract to enter into. What if you need to hire a company to perform research? You'll take that research and then you'll use it to incorporate it into a product later. So what type of contract would you use for that? Well, hopefully you thought of cost reimbursable, because with research, it's very difficult to specify exactly what it is you need, and it could be generally done multiple different ways. So a cost reimbursable would make more sense. What about you need to replace a bridge that has given way as quickly as possible? Okay, so fixed price, because the requirements for a bridge would be, it's just replacing an existing bridge, would be pretty well known. You could describe the scope of work very easily. But to have it done as quickly as possible, you would probably want to add an incentive fee to that. Okay? Okay, so this is the end of the video 1. We have 2 more to go, but let's discuss real briefly what we talked about. We talked at a high level what the 3 main processes are in procurement and what they do, and also which process group they're in. And we did also go into the very first process, which was planned procurement management, and there's actually a lot going on in that process, especially compared to other processes which are intended to create a subsidiary plan. This one does quite a bit more than that. We talked about the 5 components of a contract. If you could remember the mnemonic cold cola, that will be helpful to you. And then we went through the different types of contracts, the fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable contracts, and talked about where the risk was depending on the type of contract. So you'll need to know the names of the contract, the acronym for the contract, and also the risk. Basically the features and characteristics of each of those contract types that we discussed. Okay, so let's move on to the second video.